The 9-to-5 schedule wasn't designed to make you productive. It was designed to disorient your brain. If you feel like Mondays are a car crash in slow motion, you're right. Your body is screaming because it knows it's about to be forced back into a cage designed in 1802. We've been told the 9-to-5 was a gift to the working class, but the truth is much darker. It started as a weaponized clock workers were forbidden to even look at. Today, your office cubicle does exactly the same thing. To understand why your Monday feels like a slow-motion car crash, we have to go back to the moment human time was stolen. Before the 19th century, nobody worked 9 to 5. Not because people were lazy or unproductive, but because time was not the thing being sold. A blacksmith worked until the horseshoe was finished. A farmer worked until the harvest was in. The task decided when work ended. The clock on a wall decided by someone else did not exist. That changed in a very specific place and moment, for reasons that had nothing to do with human productivity and everything to do with industrial output. The schedule you follow today was built in that moment, and it wasn't built for you. It started with a weaponized clock that workers were forbidden to own. Manchester, 1802. Inside the textile mills, workers were entering their 14th consecutive hour of labor. They had begun before sunrise. They would finish long after dark. 6 days a week, sometimes 7, in rooms choked with cotton dust and a machinery roar so relentless it stopped registering as sound. Children worked alongside adults, 10 years old, 12, pulling broken threads from spinning spindles in spaces too narrow for a grown body. What governed this misery was not the task. A bell rang and work began. Another bell rang and work stopped. Between those two sounds, every single minute belonged completely to the factory owner, not by law or mutual agreement, but because the master held the clock and the workers did not. The architecture itself was part of the trap. The rooms were deliberately sealed from natural light. Natural light carries critical environmental information: the shifting angle of the sun, the cooling temperature of the afternoon, that tells the human body how long it has been exposed and how much longer it can safely sustain effort. Strip that information away, and the brain loses its primary mechanism for regulating fatigue. A worker who cannot read the sky cannot tell how much of themselves they have already surrendered. The mill owners understood this psychological disorientation long before the science could prove it. To secure absolute control, owners forbade workers from bringing their own watches onto the floor. The factory clock was the monopoly baseline. Documented historical accounts reveal a brutal baseline strategy. Owners routinely moved the clock hands forward during shifts to extract free labor, and moved them backward during meal breaks to shorten rest. The workers knew they were being robbed, but they had no data to prove it, and no recourse to stop it. What these factories produced, far beyond their physical output of cotton, iron, and goods, was an entirely new relationship between human beings and time. The social historian E.P. Thompson dedicated years to documenting this quiet psychological coup in his landmark work, Time, Work, Discipline, and Industrial Capitalism. What Thompson uncovered was not just a shift in labor laws, but an absolute colonization of the human mind. Before the factory, time followed the task. After it, time followed the clock. And the moment you begin selling time itself rather than the value of your finished work, your employer inherits a brutal financial incentive to aggressively fill every single running minute. Your job doesn't require this. The clock is running on their dime, and they intend to extract its full value. To understand how profound this shift was, you have to look at what it replaced. For millennia, human effort was cyclical, seasonal, and organic. If a downpour hit, the farmer stopped. If the iron cooled, the blacksmith paused. Work possessed a natural ebb and flow. It was punctuated by intense bursts of energy, followed by periods of authentic, unmonitored rest. There was no concept of wasting time, because time was not a vessel you were expected to fill. It was simply the medium in which you lived. The industrial grid shattered this reality by turning time into a currency. It commodified the hours of your life, transforming them into discrete, identical blocks that could be bought, sold, and audited. For the first time in history, standing still became a financial crime against the enterprise. If a worker paused for a breath or stared out a window, they weren't just resting. They were actively stealing from the factory owner's ledger. Thompson illustrated what this did to everyday human experience with an unsettling precision. In this new, clock-oriented society, people stopped eating and sleeping because they were hungry or tired, and began eating and sleeping because an external dial dictated it was mealtime or bedtime. The clock ceased to be a tool for measuring the day. It became the active governor of consciousness. The natural rhythms your body used to get things done for thousands of years were suddenly swept aside. They were replaced by an artificial, relentless grid that ignores how your heart, brain, and muscles actually work. Your internal compass was replaced by a ticking clock. Once the clock became the master, a deep psychological tension was inevitable. Human nature was always going to mount a resistance against an environment engineered to treat it like gears in a machine. This constant, grinding friction between biological design and mechanical demands created a completely new kind of internal crisis. It was a silent battle for autonomy, played out over seconds and minutes, setting the stage for a century of escalation. The history we are told about the modern workday usually sounds like a clean, inevitable march toward progress. We are taught that the 8-hour day was a natural compromise between economic growth and human well-being. But that narrative is a comforting lie designed to obscure a much darker reality. The boundary you rely on to separate your life from your labor was not a gift from enlightened corporations. It was a hard-fought trench line drawn in blood, purchased at an immense human cost by people who recognized that the clock had become an engine of total human extraction. By 1817, the early cracks in the industrial machine were becoming impossible to ignore. A Welsh mill owner named Robert Owen looked at the hollowed-out faces of his workers and realized the system was burning through its own human capital at an unsustainable rate. He began publicly advancing a radical blueprint for the human day, distilled into a precise, unyielding slogan: 8 hours labor, 8 hours recreation, 8 hours rest. Owen wasn't acting out of pure, altruistic charity. He had tested shorter shifts in his own factories and discovered a shocking truth that corporate logic still struggles to accept. Less exhausted human beings produce more reliable, higher quality output. It wasn't a humanitarian plea, it was an optimization metric. Yet the ruling capitalist class did not look at Owen's data and quietly surrender their monopoly on human attention. To the captains of industry, the 8-hour day was an existential threat to the very foundation of their wealth. It took an entire century of organized resistance, systemic strikes, and calculated state violence for that baseline observation to become anything close to policy. But this data wasn't enough to change the world. The ruling class didn't want a more efficient worker. They wanted a controlled one. This tension finally exploded in May 1886 on the streets of Chicago into what would become known as the Haymarket Affair. What began as a peaceful, unified demonstration for the simple right to stop working after 8 hours rapidly spiraled into a clash of absolute control. An unknown individual threw a bomb into the advancing police line. In the chaotic gunfire that followed, 7 officers and 4 civilians were killed, and dozens more were permanently mangled. The response from the system was immediate and merciless. The state didn't just arrest individuals. It prosecuted the entire concept of the 8-hour boundary as an act of criminal conspiracy against the industrial order. 8 labor organizers were rounded up in a highly politicized trial. 4 of them were sent to the gallows and publicly hanged. The men who died on that scaffold were not dangerous radicals trying to destroy civilization. They were ordinary people standing directly in the way of an industrial framework that assumed human time was an infinite resource to be mined without limit. The system was willing to execute its own citizens to defend that single, profitable assumption. This is the heavy historical weight you carry every time you look at the time remaining on your shift. The 8-hour perimeter that shapes your entire domestic life. The boundary that dictates when you set your alarm, when you see your family, and when you are permitted to rest, was bought with physical casualties. It was built by workers who understood that if you do not fight for a physical limit, the clock will confidently consume everything you have to give. It took nearly 5 more decades of unrest before the government finally codified the limit. In 1869, President Ulysses S. Grant guaranteed the 8-hour day exclusively for government employees. But it wasn't until the devastating economic collapse of the Great Depression and Roosevelt's 1933 National Industrial Recovery Act that the 40-hour week finally crystallized into a nationwide legal standard. The wall had been built, but capital was already engineering a way to turn that wall into a brand new marketplace. The creation of the 40-hour week is often celebrated as the ultimate triumph of human empathy over corporate greed. The conventional story tells us that regular people fought, the state intervened, and capitalism finally grew a conscience. But this narrative completely misunderstands the adaptive nature of modern economic systems. Capital did not yield to the 8-hour limit because it was defeated. It yielded because it discovered a far more sophisticated, far more profitable way to exploit the boundaries of human existence. The true architect of this modern compromise was not a labor reformer, but the ultimate titan of industrial efficiency, Henry Ford. On May 1st, 1926, the Ford Motor Company did something that shocked the industrial world. Without any new legislative mandate or immediate union strike, Ford voluntarily transitioned his entire manufacturing empire to a strict 5-day, 40-hour work week. To the public, it looked like an act of unprecedented corporate benevolence. But Ford was never a humanitarian. He was a cold, calculating mathematician of human utility, and he saw something his contemporaries were entirely blind to. Ford realized that an exhausted, broken worker who spends 14 hours a day on a factory floor is a deeply flawed economic unit. They are too tired to do anything but survive, and a population trapped in pure survival mode is a population that buys nothing but bread. Ford explained his logic with brutal transparency in a 1926 interview. He noted that leisure is not a loss of production. It is an absolute prerequisite for market demand. A man who works all day long has no time to cultivate desires. He has no time to look at a car, no time to dream of travel, and no time to spend money. By granting workers a 2-day weekend, Ford wasn't giving them their lives back. He was giving them the time required to become consumers. The strategy worked with terrifying efficiency. Within 24 months of adopting the 40-hour week, Ford's profit margins nearly doubled. He had successfully solved the fundamental crisis of the industrial age, overproduction. By shortening the working day, he simultaneously stabilized his assembly lines and created an entire domestic market to buy the very products those lines were churning out. The worker was no longer just a gear in the machine. They were now the fuel that kept the machine running. This realization fundamentally shifted the architecture of control. The 40-hour week was simultaneously a genuine labor victory and an aggressive commercial calculation. Workers won vital protection from unlimited physical extraction. But in return, capital discovered that moderated extraction produced a far more reliable, far more cooperative output within a single generation. This specific convergence became so universal, so utterly absolute, that the question of whether this was the correct shape for human life simply stopped being asked. The grid was locked into place. The 8 hours of work paid for the lifestyle, and the 8 hours of leisure were immediately commercialized to ensure the worker had to return to the desk on Monday morning to pay for the weekend. The prison hadn't disappeared. It had simply expanded its perimeter to include the department store, the suburb, and the automated lifestyle. The clock was no longer just a tool inside the factory walls. It was now the rhythm of the entire consumer world. While economic systems and corporate structures easily adapted to the 40-hour grid, the human body never did. The biology of the modern worker has spent the last 2 centuries running a silent, instinctual counterinsurgency against the clock. We pretend that our desks, open-plan offices, and spreadsheets are miles away from the brutal textile mills of 1802. But your central nervous system cannot tell the difference between an industrial bell and a calendar notification. It only knows that its internal rhythms are being violently overridden. Modern science is finally proving what your body already knows. A recent study found that just 7 hours of office work causes actual physical damage to your brain's networks. And here's the kicker. Standard breaks, like grabbing a coffee or scrolling your phone, don't fix it. The damage stays even after 4 hours of rest. The researchers were unstintingly direct in their conclusion. Short breaks do not heal the damage. The structure of the day itself is the toxic variable, and the exhaustion it inflicts doesn't magically vanish when the clock strikes 5. The root of this systemic burnout lies in a fundamental evolutionary mismatch. The human brain was meticulously designed around task completion, not time completion. When an organism focuses on a specific, tangible goal, tracking an animal, building a shelter, or finishing a physical object, the brain tracks progress toward a clear end state. Achieving that end state triggers a distinct neurochemical release, a physiological closing of the loop that signals the nervous system that it is safe to enter a state of deep, restorative recovery. Clock time completely breaks this mechanism. In a 9-to-5 environment, you do not stop because the work is done. You stop because the clock orders you to. This forces the mind into a state of permanent interruption. Think of the specific, heavy texture of a Thursday afternoon. Your exhaustion isn't the clean tiredness that follows a hard day of completed labor. It is a diffuse, suffocating mental fog born from a mountain of open loops. It is the unfinished report you had to drop mid-sentence, the overflowing inbox that is constantly refreshing, the fragmented project carried over into tomorrow, and tomorrow's tasks already leaking into next week. None of it is finished in the way a blacksmith finishes a horseshoe and sets it down. Because these tasks are permanently suspended in midair, they continue to run like malignant background applications in your subconscious mind, quietly draining your cognitive batteries long after you have logged off. The body enters the weekend not to rest, but to slowly bleed off the toxic accumulation of a week spent working against its own design. The 8-hour boundary that workers fought and died for was meant to be a wall that protected your life from your labor. But that wall has been demolished, not by a boss, but by the device in your pocket. Here is how they finally got inside your home. When email infiltrated the office landscape, it severed the physical tie between work and place. Suddenly, you could be tracked down anywhere, at any hour, without setting foot in the building. Then, the smartphone arrived, transforming the heavy surveillance of the historical factory floor into a sleek glass object carried directly in your pocket. The expectation that messages sent outside of contract hours would be answered immediately became an unwritten, unquestioned norm. In knowledge worker environments, defending the boundary didn't look like an act of self-preservation anymore. It was reframed as a failure of commitment. Consider the reality of a standard evening. The official shift ends, the desk is left behind, and you return home. But the phone sits on the table, face down, in a gesture toward rest that never truly achieves its goal, because the gesture itself requires conscious effort. At 9:30 p.m., a notification illuminates the screen. An email arrives. You read it, not because you chose to, but because availability has been systematically engineered into an obligation. The immediate cortisol spike is identical to the stress response felt by a worker in the 1802 textile mills. The systemic problem contained in that message instantly colonizes your mind, violently reclaiming the hours that were supposed to belong to your life. Whether you answer it immediately or try to ignore it, the damage is done. The working day has breached the perimeter of your home, and your evening has surrendered its ground without you even noticing the theft. This is the ultimate evolution of scientific management. Frederick Winslow Taylor, the industrial engineer who viewed human beings as mere optimizable components of a machine, would look at the modern digital landscape with profound admiration. His ghost lives inside every calendar alert, every instant message, and every push notification. The factory didn't disappear. It simply became invisible, transforming the room you sleep in into the final supervisor. The Sunday night anxiety you experience isn't a personal failing. It is a highly accurate, intuitive reading of an inherited structure that was never designed with your humanity in mind. The schedule you are forced to run was built for a steam-powered textile mill, weaponized by corporate efficiency experts and digitized by the tech in your pocket. Your body has known this truth all along. It has been trying to tell you for years.